I'm Annabelle. And I've always believed that you can tell the truth about a person by the way they treat people who can offer them anything in return. My parents taught me that without ever saying it outright. Daniel, my dad, spent 3 decades bent over engines, coaxing dead cars back to life with patience and knuckle-splitting work. Rosa, my mom, ran a grocery store like a captain at sea, steady hands, sharp eyes, and a kindness that somehow never ran out. They gave me a childhood built on scraped knees and earned pride, the kind that doesn't glitter but lasts. So when Ethan Miller proposed, slipping a ring onto my finger with a look that said we were building a future together, I let myself believe the best. The Millers were old Chicago, which sounded romantic if you didn't look too closely. They had penthouses with views that made the city look small, charity galas where people applauded themselves for being generous, and friends whose names were said like titles. I knew they were snobs. I thought snobbery was just bad manners you could ignore. I didn't realize it could be a philosophy. The first warning came disguised as helpfulness. The seating chart, Ethan said, should be handled by his mother. Carol's the hostess of the century, Belle, he told me, brushing my cheek with his thumb like he was smoothing away a worry. She knows the politics. Let her take the headache. I remember the way I smiled, wanting to be easy, wanting to be loved without becoming a problem. I let it go. That was my first mistake. The Grand Willow Ballroom looked like money learned to float. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, and every surface gleamed with polished certainty. When I entered the reception after the ceremony, the room was a warm blur of champagne and silk, and everyone's laughter sounded practiced, like it had been rehearsed in front of mirrors. The head table, what people were already calling the power table, ran long and bright beneath the biggest chandelier. Carol and Big Jean sat in the center, as if the room had arranged itself around them. On either side were a state senator, an investment CEO, and a cluster of people who spoke in careful, expensive sentences. I searched for my parents with the same instinct you use to find home in a crowd. They weren't near the family tables. They weren't in the first rows, either, where the faces were familiar and the smiles were wide enough to be photographed. I kept looking, weaving past servers carrying trays as if they were balancing the entire evening. I found them in the exile zone. That's what my mind named it before my heart could. A back corner near the swinging doors to the kitchen, tucked beside a pillar that blocked half the room. The tablecloth there wasn't quite as crisp. The centerpiece looked like it had been borrowed from an office lobby. Thin flowers. No scent. My parents sat close together, hands folded, dressed in the best they owned. Dad's suit fit him the way honesty fits a man, not flashy but true. Mom's hair was pinned up neatly, and her lipstick was the same soft red she wore to my graduations. They looked like guests at someone else's party, which made my stomach twist because they had spent my whole life making sure I never felt like that. My mother's smile lifted when she saw me, brave and immediate. "Mia," she mouthed, like she didn't want to disturb the air. My father stood, a little too quickly, and the chair legs scraped the floor. He tried to hide the sound with a laugh that didn't quite land. I stared down at the place card on the table as if it might apologize. It didn't. It simply said Daniel and Rosa Rivera in neat black ink, and the neatness of it felt cruel. "Belle," Ethan's voice came from behind me, light and careless. "There you are, Mom's been looking for you." "Pictures soon." I turned. He looked perfect, tuxedo, polished shoes, the face that used to make me think I'd won the lottery of love. Then his eyes flicked to my parents' table, and something in his expression tightened, not with shame, but with calculation. "Why are they back here?" I asked, and it shocked me how steady my voice sounded. Like my parents had taught me, dignity first, even when your insides are shaking. Ethan blinked. "It's just how Mom arranged things. Space is limited at the front, you know. It's not a big deal, not a big deal." My father's hands, scarred from wrenches and burns, were folded politely beside his plate. My mother, who had stocked shelves and studied under flickering lamps to get me through college, was pretending she couldn't hear the music from the main floor because it didn't reach this corner cleanly. And Ethan, my husband, was telling me it wasn't a big deal. I looked past him and saw Carol across the room, watching with a smile that held no warmth. She lifted her glass slightly, as if toasting her own cleverness. Something inside me went quiet, the way a shop does when the lights turn off and the last customer leaves. In that silence, I understood what this family valued, and it wasn't love. It was proximity to power, the shine of names, the performance of belonging. They weren't seating my parents. They were placing them. I stepped closer to Ethan until he could see himself reflected in my eyes. "That's my family," I said. "The people who made me." He gave a small, placating chuckle. "Annabelle, don't start something tonight, please. It's our wedding." I glanced down at my white dress, the fabric flowing like a promise. I had thought it meant joining his world. Now I realized it meant choosing what kind of world I would live in. I turned back to my parents. My mother's gaze held mine, steady as a lighthouse. My father's jaw was tight, but his eyes were gentle, as if he'd already decided to swallow the insult so I wouldn't have to carry it. I didn't let him. I reached for 2 empty chairs from a nearby table and dragged them across the floor. The scrape was loud and heads turned. A few people frowned the way the wealthy do when the evening stops being smooth. I didn't care. I carried the chairs toward the front of the room, toward the bright power table, and placed them right beside mine. Then I walked back, took my parents by the hand's oil-stained history and grocery store strength, and led them forward through the stunned silence like I was escorting royalty. Because to me they were... Carol's smile faltered. Big Jean's eyes widened. Ethan said my name once, sharp, like a warning. I didn't look at him. When my parents sat beside me at the head table, my mother's hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. My father cleared his throat and tried to smile, but his eyes shone with something that wasn't tears, exactly more like a lifetime of being overlooked finally meeting the light. The band stumbled, then kept playing.
Conversation restarted in hesitant ripples. Somewhere, a glass clinked against another.
And I sat between the world that thought money was the only measure and the 2 people who proved every day that it wasn't tea. In that moment, I didn't know what the rest of the night would cost me, what arguments would follow, what masks would drop, what kind of marriage I was truly in. But I did know one thing with absolute clarity. Love doesn't require a bank statement. It requires a spine. Richard Hale stepped closer to the edge of the dance floor, the light catching the silver at his temples like a warning. He didn't look at Carol when he spoke again. He looked at my father, the way you look at someone whose hands can do something yours never learned. 60s era, he repeated, as if tasting the decade. My first real job was sweeping floors in my uncle's body shop. I've still got the scar from a grinder that taught me patience. A few people laughed politely, unsure whether they were allowed. The sound died quickly when Richard's gaze lifted, calm and flat, sweeping the room like a slow blade. "What model do you like best, Daniel?" My father's throat moved as he swallowed. I watched him straighten, not in pride my dad didn't. He know how to preen, but in that quiet way people stand when they finally addressed as a person instead of furniture. "I love a 67 Impala," he said carefully. "Big engine, heavy, but if you do it right, it floats." "I like the ones people think are too far gone." Richard's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something more private. "Too far gone," he echoed, and for the first time that night, the room felt like it belonged to someone besides Carol. My father had one, navy blue, sold it when things got tight. "I looked for that car for 20 years. He paused, and the pause held the entire ballroom by the throat. "I never found it. But I found something better. People who know how to bring broken things back." Ethan's father, Gerald, shifted like a man trying to reposition a sinking ship with his hands. Carol's rubies glittered angrily when she crossed her arms, chin raised in the hard, rehearsed posture of superiority. But Richard did not offer her the courtesy of attention. He turned his body slightly, facing my parents, and in doing so, he changed the geometry of the room. Everyone angled themselves toward him automatically, investors and executives and women draped in jewels, all pivoting like sunflowers. "Gerald," Richard said, finally letting Ethan's father exist in his line of sight, "you've been telling me for a year and a half that your company values craftsmanship, that you invest in people, not just projections." He nodded toward my mother. "Is that true, or is it just a paragraph in a pitch deck?" Gerald's smile trembled. "Of course it's true, Richard." Richard lifted a hand, one simple motion, and Gerald's words stopped mid-air. Then you'll understand why I'm asking to speak to Daniel and Rosa Martinez tomorrow morning. Not your CFO, not your brand strategist, the people who raised the woman who just reminded your entire guest list what dignity looks like. His eyes found me then, and for a second, I saw something in them that startled me. Approval. Yes, but also recognition, like he'd known girls like me. Girls who learned how to swallow hunger so their siblings could eat. Girls who learned how to sound confident in rooms designed to make them quiet. Carol laughed sharp, offended too loud. Richard, surely you're not suggesting. He turned his head toward her, and the laughter snapped off like a wire pulled taut. The air around him didn't change. Exactly. It simply clarified. I'm not suggesting, he said. I'm deciding. His voice remained even, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to rooms becoming silent for him. And I'm also deciding something else. He glanced at Ethan, then at me, then back to Carol. If this is what legacy looks like in your family, humiliating the people who sacrificed so your guests could sip champagne, I am not interested in being allied with it. The words landed without fireworks, without drama, and that made them worse. It was like watching an expensive vase slip from a shelf in slow motion. No one could stop it. Everyone could see it shatter. Ethan's face went slack, then red. He stood so abruptly his chair squealed. Richard, with respect. Richard didn't even blink. Sit down, Ethan. 2 words, a command. Ethan froze, as if his body had forgotten it owned itself, and then he sat because the room demanded it. Because power, true power, doesn't raise its voice. My mother's fingers were still worrying the edge of her napkin. I reached for her hand under the table, feeling her palm damp with stress. She squeezed back hard, as if anchoring herself to something solid. My father stared at Richard like he couldn't decide whether to be grateful or embarrassed. That was my dad. He didn't like being looked at, not even kindly. He liked to work with his head down, let the results speak. Carol's cheeks were mottled. This is outrageous, she whispered, but her whisper was loud in the silence. We're simply trying to maintain standards. Richard tilted his head. Standards. He glanced at her rubies. You're confusing standards with decoration. Then, almost casually, he added, Daniel, do you have a card? My father patted his jacket, fumbling. Of course he did. He always had cards, plain white with black text, because my mother insisted it mattered. He held it out with 2 fingers, like offering something too small to be worth anyone's time. Richard took it like it was a key. He studied it, then nodded once. Tomorrow, 9, bring photos of your work. Rosa, if you're willing, I'd like to hear about the sacrifices you made to put your daughter through school. Not for sentiment. His gaze sharpened. For context. People who climb without forgetting who held the ladder are the only people I trust. At the head table, Gerald's face had gone papery.
He opened his mouth, closed it.
His hands were flat on the tablecloth like he was holding himself down. And Ethan finally looked at me, not as a fiancé, not as a prop beside his deal, but as a problem he didn't know how to negotiate. His eyes flicked to his mother, then to Richard, then back to me, and I saw the calculation happening in real time. Which side would cost less? Something inside my chest cooled, crystallized. Not heartbreak, clarity. I stood, still holding my mother's hand for a beat, then let go. The microphone cord was still trailing near the kitchen doors, a black vein across the polished floor. I stepped over it and walked toward the center of the room where my parents now sat, no longer quarantined, no longer hidden. The noise from the industrial kitchen still crashed and clattered behind us. The swinging doors still exhaled cold air, but it didn't feel like shame anymore. It felt like proof. Proof of work. Proof of survival. Carol watched me with a smile that tried to recover its shape. Annabelle, she said, voice syrupy now. Let's not let a misunderstanding ruin the evening. I looked at her jewels, at her polished cruelty. Then I looked at Ethan, who could not meet my eyes for longer than a second. The evening isn't ruined, I said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. My voice didn't shake. It's just finally honest. I turned to my father. Dad, I said softly, will you dance with Mom? He blinked, startled by the tenderness after all the steel. My mother's eyes widened, shining. Then my father stood, offered his hand, and my mother rose as if she'd been waiting for that invitation her whole life. The band, confused but sensing the shift, started a slow song, something simple, something human. Around them, the ballroom held its breath. My parents moved carefully at first, like they were afraid of stepping on a world that didn't belong to them. Then my father whispered something in Spanish that made my mother laugh, an actual laugh, warm and unguarded, and their bodies relaxed into the rhythm. They belonged, not because Carol granted it, because I had. Richard Hale watched them for a moment, then nodded to himself and walked out, already making calls that would reroute fortunes. Investors began to murmur, not about Gerald's deal, but about Daniel Martinez, the man who could make a '67 Impala float. And, as my parents danced in the center of the room, I realized my empty chair wasn't at their table anymore. It was at Ethan's, a seat glaring and obvious and deserved. "I've got a '67 Mustang Fastback that 3 shops have ruined," Richard said, ignoring Carol entirely. "Why don't you come by my estate Monday? We'll talk business." Real business. Then Richard looked at Big Gene, Ethan's father. "Gene, your wife's speech was illuminating. I don't invest in companies run by people who think they read better than the people who build this country. My grandfather was a coal miner. I guess my rough edges are still showing." Richard Hale walked out. And with him, the $50 million investment deal that was the backbone of the Miller family firm walked out the door. The fallout was nuclear. By the next morning, a video of Carol's humble beginnings speech had gone viral. Brent, the coworker who had switched tables, had recorded the whole thing. He'd been passed over for a promotion the month before in favor of a guy with a better last name, and he was done staying quiet. By noon, the Miller firm's social media was a graveyard of angry comments from former employees and clients. By evening, 2 other major partners pulled out. The exclusivity they had spent decades building became a noose around their necks. In our hotel suite, the air was thick with the smell of a dying marriage. "You ruined us," Ethan said.
He wasn't even looking at me.
He was looking at his phone, watching the stock price of his father's company tumble. One seating chart. "You could have just sat there and been a bride. But you had to be a martyr." "I wasn't a martyr, Ethan," I said, packing my bags. "I was a daughter. And if you can't understand why that table mattered more than your father's alliances, then you never really knew me at all." "My mother is devastated," he snapped. "The charity board asked her to resign." "Good," I said. "Maybe now she have time to learn how to be a human being." I walked out of that hotel room and never looked back. The divorce was messy, but I didn't care. I didn't want their money. I didn't want their legacy. A week later, I went to my parents' house. My dad was out in the driveway. Parked there was a stunning, albeit battered, 1967 Mustang. Richard Hale was standing there in a pair of jeans, holding a wrench, laughing as my dad explained the firing order of the engine. My dad looked at me and winked. "You were right, Belle," he said. The view from the center table was okay, but the view from the garage? That's where the real work gets done. Ethan and his family lost their status, their deal, and their important reputation. They built their world on the idea that some people belong in the back. They forgot one simple thing. When you push the most important people to the kitchen, don't be surprised when they decide to burn the house down. I didn't ruin their world, I just moved a table. They're the ones who tripped over the chairs.